Just one ragged breath can shatter a decades-old lie. When a struggling waitress looked down at the wrist of the city's most ruthless billionaire, she didn't just see a birthmark. She saw a ghost. What followed was a twist nobody could have predicted. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sapphire Room, Manhattan's most exclusive dining establishment. Inside, the atmosphere was completely insulated from the storm, smelling faintly of expensive truffles, aged oak, and the subtle metallic tang of extreme wealth. Jamie adjusted the starched collar of her uniform, her fingers trembling slightly. She had been working double shifts for 3 weeks straight, her feet aching with a dull, rhythmic throb that matched her heartbeat. At 26, Jamie's life was an endless loop of balancing trays and balancing checkbooks. Her mother, Margaret, was tucked away in a modest care facility in Queens, her memory slowly unspooling from early-onset dementia. The bills were a crushing weight, and the Sapphire Room was the only place that paid enough in tips to keep the wolves from the door. "Posture, Jamie. He's here," hissed Felix, the floor manager, his face pale with a mixture of reverence and sheer panic. He was Harrison Montgomery. Harrison was a titan of industry, a man whose venture capital firm had bought and sold half the tech startups on the eastern seaboard. He was famously reclusive, known for his bespoke Italian suits, his icy demeanor, and a ruthless business acumen that left competitors in ruins. He rarely dined out, and when he did, the staff was expected to be invisible, silent and flawless. Jamie grabbed her silver tray, taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. She followed Felix into the private dining alcove, a secluded area draped in heavy velvet curtains. Harrison sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by 3 nervous-looking executives. He was an imposing figure, with silver-flecked dark hair and piercing hawkish eyes that seemed to dissect everything they landed on. As Jamie approached to pour the vintage Cabernet, the executives were engaged in a heated, hushed debate about a hostile takeover. Harrison, however, seemed entirely detached. He reached for his water glass, and as he did, the cuff of his immaculately tailored, crisp white shirt rode up his forearm. Jamie froze. The heavy crystal wine bottle in her hand suddenly felt like it was made of lead. There on the inside of Harrison Montgomery's left wrist was a birthmark. But it wasn't just any birthmark. It was a dark crimson blemish, shaped remarkably like a crescent moon, jagged on the inner curve and culminating in 3 distinct star-like points. The air in Jamie's lungs vanished. The high-end restaurant, the murmuring executives, the pounding rain outside, it all faded into a deafening roar of static. She knew that mark. She had traced it with her tiny fingers when she was 4 years old. She had kissed it before bed. She had stared at it in the only surviving photograph she kept on her nightstand. It was an incredibly rare, vascular anomaly. Her father Samuel used to joke that he was branded by the night sky. Samuel had died in a horrific, fiery car crash 22 years ago, leaving Margaret and baby Jamie with nothing but a mountain of debt and a sealed casket. "Miss," the sharp, irritated voice snapped Jamie back to reality. The wine had overfilled the glass and was pooling onto the pristine white tablecloth, spreading like a fresh blood stain. I apologize." Jamie stammered her hands, shaking so violently she had to set the bottle down. She grabbed a linen napkin, frantically dabbing at the spill. Harrison Montgomery looked down at the mess, his expression hardening into a mask of pure disdain. "Get someone else," he commanded coldly, not even looking at her. Someone competent. Felix was there in an instant, practically shoving Jamie aside profusely, apologizing to the billionaire. But Jamie couldn't move away. Her feet were glued to the lush carpet. Her eyes remained locked on Harrison's face. He was older, his features sharpened by time and wealth, but the underlying bone structure, the strong jawline, the slight indentation on his left temple, it was all there. Before her brain could catch up with the sheer insanity of her actions, her mouth opened. "Hi, sir," Jamie said, her voice piercing the tense silence of the alcove. It wasn't a whisper. It was clear, ringing with a desperate kind of clarity. My father had the exact same birthmark. The entire table fell dead silent. The executive stared at her in horror. Felix looked as though he might faint. Harrison Montgomery's hand paused over his napkin. Slowly he lifted his head, his dark eyes locking on to Jamie's. For a fraction of a second, the impenetrable wall of his composure cracked. A flicker of something visceral, shock recognition, or perhaps raw fear flashed across his face before the icy mask slammed back into place. He didn't look at her wrist. He didn't ask what she meant. He slowly pulled his cuff down, buttoning it with deliberate, terrifying precision. "Felix," Harrison said softly, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Remove her from my sight. Immediately." "You're fired, Jamie. Get your things and get out," Felix hissed, grabbing her elbow and physically hauling her backward through the curtains. As the velvet dropped shut, obscuring the billionaire from view, Jamie realized she was trembling uncontrollably. She hadn't just made a mistake. She had poked a sleeping dragon. But the image of that crimson crescent was burned into her mind. Samuel was dead. She had seen the death certificate, so who the hell was Harrison Montgomery? The subway ride back to Jamie's cramped apartment in Brooklyn was a blur. The rhythmic clacking of the train over the tracks sounded like a ticking clock in her head. She had just lost her livelihood, her only way to pay Margaret's care facility, but the panic of unemployment was entirely overshadowed by a consuming, terrifying obsession. When she walked through her front door, she didn't bother taking off her damp coat. She went straight for her bedroom closet, dragging out a heavy, dust-covered plastic storage bin from the top shelf. It contained the remnants of her mother's past things Margaret had packed away in grief, and later in the fog of dementia. Jamie threw the lid off and dug past the old sweaters and faded greeting cards until her fingers brushed against a heavy leather album. She hauled it onto her bed, flipping through the crinkling yellowed pages. There he was. Samuel, a man with a warm smile, wearing a cheap mechanic's uniform, holding a toddler on his shoulders. Jamie traced his face. He looked nothing like a billionaire. He was a working-class man who came home smelling of motor oil and cheap coffee. But then she found a different picture. It was a Polaroid taken at a summer barbecue long before she was born. Samuel was sitting on a porch, laughing, his sleeves rolled up in the summer heat. And there it was, glaringly obvious, the crimson, jagged crescent moon on his left wrist. Jamie pulled her phone out, her thumbs flying across the screen as she searched for Harrison Montgomery. Articles flooded the screen. The Enigma of Wall Street. Montgomery's ruthless rise. She scoured his biography. It was notoriously vague. According to the official narrative, Harrison came from old money in Europe, lived abroad for his early 20s, and burst onto the American financial scene exactly 20 years ago, 2 years after her father's fatal accident. There were no childhood photos of Harrison, no records of his high school graduation. It was as if the man had simply materialized out of thin air with a fortune and a new identity. "It can't be," Jamie whispered to the empty room. "It's a coincidence, a freak medical coincidence." But her gut screamed otherwise. That flicker of raw panic in Montgomery's eyes when she mentioned the birthmark, that wasn't the reaction of a man brushing off a crazy waitress. That was the reaction of a man whose deepest, darkest secret had just been dragged into the light. She needed to know more. Jamie spent the next 48 hours glued to her laptop, surviving on cheap instant coffee and adrenaline. She dug into public records, obscure financial blogs, and archived newspaper clippings. She found the police report of Samuel's death. The car had gone off a cliff on a winding coastal road in upstate New York. The vehicle had caught fire, burning the occupant beyond recognition. Dental records had confirmed it was Samuel. The case was closed. But as Jamie cross-referenced the dates, a chilling narrative began to form. Just months before his death, Samuel, a lowly mechanic, had filed a patent for a revolutionary valve design used in high-pressure industrial machinery. It was a brilliant piece of engineering. After his death, the patent was mysteriously withdrawn. A year later, a newly formed company called Montech launched a flagship product based on that exact same valve design. The founder of Montech, a virtually unknown, newly minted millionaire named Harrison Montgomery. Jamie felt the blood drain from her face. Her father hadn't just died in a random accident. He had been erased. And the man wearing his face, wearing his birthmark, had stolen his invention, faked his death, and built an empire on the ashes of his own family. But why? Why leave his wife and daughter to suffer in poverty? The rage that ignited in Jamie's chest was unlike anything she had ever felt. It burned away the fear, the exhaustion, the panic of being unemployed. She wasn't just a fired waitress anymore. She was the daughter of a ghost, and she was going to demand answers. Getting to Harrison Montgomery wasn't going to be easy. He lived in a fortress-like penthouse and worked in a building with tighter security than the Pentagon. But Jamie knew something about the elite they loved to show off for charity. A quick search revealed that Harrison was the keynote speaker at the Gala for the Future, a highly publicized philanthropic event being held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art that very weekend. Jamie emptied her meager savings account. She went to a vintage thrift store in the garment district and bought a sleek, understated black evening gown that looked much more expensive than its $30 price tag. She spent hours watching makeup tutorials, transforming her tired, overworked face into a mask of high society elegance. On Saturday night, it was pouring rain again. Jamie stood across the street from the Met, watching the line of black town cars pull up to the red carpet. She knew she couldn't walk through the front door without an invitation, but she had spent her entire adult life in the hospitality industry. She knew how the back of the house worked. She bypassed the paparazzi and slipped down a side alley toward the service entrance. Two massive security guards stood by the doors checking catering badges. Jamie didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy box of floral centerpieces, sitting abandoned on a loading cart, hoisted it onto her hip to obscure her face, and walked toward the doors with purpose, projecting an aura of stressed, overworked urgency. "Hey, where's your badge?" one of the guards grunted. "Left it in the truck, and if these hydrangeas aren't on table 4 in the next 3 minutes, the coordinator is going to have both our jobs." Jamie snapped, mimicking the exact tone Felix used during a dinner rush. "Do you want to explain to the event planner why the centerpieces are dead?" The guard frowned, intimidated by her confidence, and stepped aside. "Just get in." Jamie slipped through the heavy metal doors, immediately ditching the flowers in a service hallway. She navigated the labyrinth of the museum's back corridors, following the sound of string quartets and clinking champagne flutes. She emerged into the main hall, blending seamlessly into the crowd of billionaires, politicians, and socialites. Her eyes scanned the room, darting past diamonds and designer tuxedos until she found him. Harrison Montgomery was standing near the Temple of Denda, holding a glass of scotch, surrounded by a sycophantic circle of admirers. He looked completely at ease, a king holding court. Jamie didn't approach him in the crowd. She waited. She watched him with the patience of a predator. After an hour, Harrison excused himself, handing his glass to a passing waiter. He walked away from the main exhibit hall, heading toward a quiet, dimly lit corridor that led to the private restrooms. Jamie followed her heart, pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She waited until he turned the corner, ensuring the corridor was empty of security. Did the dental records cost a lot to fake Harrison? Her voice echoed off the marble walls, sharp as glass. Harrison froze. He turned around slowly. When he saw Jamie standing there in her black gown, the color completely vanished from his face. For the first time, the great billionaire looked like a cornered animal. "You," he breathed, taking a step backward. "Me," Jamie said, stepping closer, closing the distance between them. "Or should I call you Samuel? It's been 22 years, Dad. I think it's time we caught up." A single damning birthmark exposed a billionaire's darkest lie. Jamie, a struggling waitress, just cornered the most powerful man in Manhattan, accusing him of being her dead father. The truth she is about to uncover involves faked deaths, corporate assassins, and a secret that will rewrite her entire existence. Harrison's glass shattered against the marble floor, the sharp crack echoing through the empty museum corridor like a gunshot. The amber liquid seeped into the grout, but he didn't even glance down. His eyes, usually cold and unreadable, were wide with a terror Jamie had never seen. He lunged forward, not to attack her, but to grab her elbow, his grip agonizingly tight. He dragged her out of the open corridor, pushing through an unmarked maintenance door into a dark, cramped security closet, filled with monitors and cleaning supplies. He slammed the heavy door shut, plunging them into dim, flickering fluorescent light. "Are you insane?" he hissed, his voice, trembling, stripped entirely of its refined billionaire cadence. It was the raw, gravelly accent of Queens, the voice of Samuel the mechanic. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Who could be listening?" Jamie ripped her arm away, her chest heaving, the cheap fabric of her thrift store gown tearing slightly at the shoulder. "I don't care who is listening. I watched my mother pack away your boots while she sobbed until she threw up. I paid for her dementia care by scrubbing toilets and waiting tables for men like you. You let us think you were dead." Samuel leaned against the cold metal shelving, his immaculate posture collapsing. He suddenly looked like a very old, very broken man. "I didn't let you think anything, Jamie. I died that night on the coastal highway. Samuel died. The dental records were a match." Jamie shot back, her voice breaking. "Who was in that car?" "Jonathan Miller," Samuel whispered, rubbing a trembling hand over his face. "The brother of Preston Miller, the CEO of Apex Industries. Jonathan was in the passenger seat. He had a gun pointed at my ribs. He demanded the patent blueprints for the industrial valve. I refused. He grabbed the wheel. The car went over the edge." Jamie stared at him, the claustrophobic air of the closet pressing down on her. Samuel unbuttoned his crisp white shirt, pulling it off his shoulders to reveal a torso completely ravaged by scars. Massive, jagged networks of burn tissue and surgical incisions crisscrossed his chest and abdomen. I was thrown through the windshield before the gas tank ignited. Jonathan burned, but I wasn't spared. I was shattered. He looked away, staring blankly at the mop bucket in the corner. An off-the-books medical extraction team found me. They were contractors paid by an anonymous rival of Preston's who wanted my technology. I woke up 3 weeks later in a clandestine intensive care unit. It was a sterile nightmare. Dr. Gallagher, the lead trauma surgeon, told me I had coded 4 times on the table. The triage protocols in that surgical theater were brutal. They treated me like a highly valuable piece of meat, not a human being. I spent 14 months hooked to ventilators, undergoing agonizing skin grafts and facial reconstruction. They rebuilt my jaw, my nose, everything. The only thing they couldn't burn away was the birthmark on my wrist. The transformation was an agonizing crucible. Samuel spent months studying linguistics to erase his thick Queen's accent, adopting the refined, clipped cadence of European aristocracy. He studied high-level corporate finance in his sterile recovery bed, reading endless textbooks, while hooked up to intravenous drips and heart monitors. He had to learn how to walk again, his muscles severely atrophied from the extended coma. Every single step was a battle against excruciating pain, but the burning need for vengeance kept him moving forward. He forged a flawless, impenetrable background story, bribing corrupt international officials to create birth certificates, passports, and banking histories for a man who didn't exist before the crash. Jamie stepped back, her hand covering her mouth, as the horrific reality of his words painted a bloody picture in her mind. The medical trauma he described was unimaginable. When I finally regained the ability to speak, Samuel continued his voice, heavy with suffocating grief. "Doctor," Gallagher gave me the news. Preston Miller had bought the police, the coroners, everyone. They swapped Jonathan's dental records with mine to cover up the botched assassination. The world believed Samuel was ashes, and Gallagher made it crystal clear Preston's mercenaries were watching Margaret and you. If I miraculously returned from the dead, Preston would know I survived the crash. He would slaughter you both in your sleep to tie up loose ends. Oh, us. "So you abandoned us," Jamie cried, tears finally spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. "To protect us, you left us to starve." "I became a ghost to hunt a monster." Samuel growled, a sudden terrifying fire reigniting in his eyes. "I took the name Harrison Montgomery. The private investors who funded my medical recovery staked me with millions in exchange for a 50% cut of my future patents. I used that money to build Monttech. I spent 22 years systematically destroying Preston Miller's empire piece by agonizing piece. I crushed his supply chains, bought out his allies, and forced his company into bankruptcy. 2 weeks ago, Preston died of a massive stroke, utterly destitute and alone." He took a ragged breath. The threat was finally gone. "I was making arrangements to reveal myself to you next month. And then you walked into the Sapphire Room." Jamie's mind was spinning, unable to process the sheer magnitude of the conspiracy. "You were watching us all these years. You knew Mum was sick. Every single day." Samuel whispered, a tear escaping his eye. "I paid the holding company that owns Margaret's care facility. I made sure she had the corner room, the absolute best neurologists, the premium medications. I couldn't visit her, Jamie. I couldn't risk Preston's spies seeing a billionaire holding the hand of a mechanic's widow. It would have unraveled the entire deception. It killed me to stay away. It ripped my soul apart every time I saw a security photo of you working yourself to the bone at that restaurant, coming home with bruised feet and exhausted eyes. But it was the only way to keep you breathing." He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a heavy, incredibly old brass key. He held it out to her, his hand shaking. "I didn't just build a company to exact revenge, Jamie. I built an empire to give you the world. I couldn't be your father, so I became your architect." Jamie stared at the brass key resting in Samuel's scarred palm. The metal caught the dim, flickering light of the security closet. She didn't take it. Her mind was a battlefield of furious resentment and overwhelming, crushing sorrow. This man had endured unimaginable medical agony, surviving a clandestine intensive care unit, just to keep her alive. Yet the price of her safety was growing up fatherless, watching her mother slowly lose her mind in a fog of dementia. She looked at his expensive, custom-tailored tuxedo, realizing it was nothing more than a suit of armor designed to intimidate his enemies. "What is that?" she asked, her voice a hollow, exhausted rasp. "It's the beginning of the rest of your life," Samuel replied, closing his fingers over the key and gently taking her hand. "Come with me. There is something you need to see, something I have been preparing for 22 years. They slipped out of the Met Museum through a loading dock door, entirely avoiding the flashbulbs of the paparazzi and the glittering elite who still thought Harrison Montgomery was sipping scotch inside. Samuel's private driver, a massive silent man named Grigori, was waiting in a heavily armored black SUV. The ride through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan was suffocatingly quiet. Jamie watched the city blur past the tinted windows, her reality completely fractured. The struggling waitress from Brooklyn had died the moment she recognized that crimson birthmark. She just didn't know who she was supposed to be now. The SUV crossed into an abandoned, highly industrialized sector of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Grigori pulled the vehicle inside a crumbling, derelict warehouse that smelled faintly of salt water, rust and decay. It was the last place on Earth a billionaire would be expected to visit. Samuel led Jamie to the back of the warehouse, stopping before a massive rusted steel blast door set deep into the concrete floor. It looked like the entrance to a forgotten Cold War bunker. He inserted the heavy brass key into a hidden mechanism, turning it with a loud grinding clank. Hydraulic locks hissed, and the heavy door slowly groaned open, revealing a brilliantly lit concrete stairwell descending deep underground. When I first started accumulating extreme wealth, I knew I needed an untraceable stronghold, Samuel explained as they walked down the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the sterile, dry air. A hidden property where Preston's corporate spies could never find my most sensitive assets. This abandoned naval bunker became my vault. At the bottom of the stairs, they entered a sprawling, climate-controlled subterranean room. Jamie gasped. The walls were lined entirely with massive, illuminated glass display cases and rows of reinforced steel filing cabinets. In the center of the room sat a massive oak desk covered in architectural blueprints, legal binders, and framed photographs. Jamie walked slowly toward the desk. Her breath caught in her throat. The framed photographs weren't of wealthy executives or politicians. They were of her. There was a picture of her walking across the stage at her high school graduation, looking terribly lonely. A picture of her sitting on a park bench, eating a cheap sandwich between double shifts. A picture of Margaret smiling vaguely in the garden of her care facility. He had documented her entire life from the shadows. "Look at the blueprints on the desk," Samuel urged, gently stepping up behind her. Jamie looked down. The blueprints were incredibly complex, detailing a massive state-of-the-art medical and research campus. The title block at the bottom of the page read, "The Margaret and Samuel Neurological Institute." "I haven't just been hoarding money, Jamie," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been funneling billions of dollars through blind trusts and offshore shell corporations. I bought hundreds of acres of prime real estate in upstate New York. I have fully funded a revolutionary research facility dedicated entirely to curing early-onset dementia and Alzheimer's disease. The construction finishes in 6 months. Margaret will be the first patient transferred there under the care of the most brilliant neurological minds on the planet." Jamie felt her knees buckle. She gripped the edge of the heavy oak desk to stay upright, staring at the blueprints until the intricate blue lines blurred beneath a fresh wave of hot tears. Samuel moved to the largest steel filing cabinet and pulled open the heavy drawer. He withdrew a massive leather-bound portfolio and placed it gently over the blueprints. "This is the Montec Master Trust," he stated, his tone suddenly shifting to a formal, commanding gravity. "Every patent, every hidden asset, every share of stock, every offshore account, and the deed to this bunker. It was all placed in an irrevocable, airtight, blind trust the day you turned 18. Harrison Montgomery doesn't own Mont Tech. He never did. Harrison Montgomery is just an employee. He opened the portfolio, revealing a single, legally binding certificate of absolute ownership. You own it, Jamie. You always have. You are the sole uncontested heir to a $90 billion empire. The board of directors thinks they answer to me, but tomorrow morning you are going to walk into that glass boardroom and take your rightful seat at the head of the table. They are ruthless, greedy men who respect only power and capital. Tomorrow you will show them both. We will walk into that skyscraper flanked by the best corporate attorneys in the hemisphere, and we will execute a hostile takeover of our own company. We will purge the remaining executives who were loyal to Preston Miller, and we will rebuild the corporate structure from the ground up, focusing on the medical technologies and industrial innovations that can actually change the world rather than just hoard wealth. You are never going to carry a tray again. You are never going to worry about a hospital bill again. Jamie looked from the legal document to the man who had sacrificed his face, his name, and his family to forge a weapon capable of protecting them. He wasn't the ruthless Wall Street enigma the media painted him to be. He was just a father who had fought his way out of hell to bring his daughter the stars. "I don't know how to run a company," Jamie whispered, terrified by the sheer weight of the inheritance resting on the desk. Samuel smiled, the jagged scars on his face softening into the warm, familiar expression she vaguely remembered from 22 years ago. "You won't have to do it alone. I'll teach you everything, if you'll let me." Jamie looked at the crimson crescent moon birthmark on his wrist. She finally let go of the anger, stepping forward to wrap her arms around the ghost she had mourned her entire life. "Okay, Dad," she cried softly into his shoulder. "Teach me. The truth can remain buried for decades, but it never truly dies. If this story of betrayal, unimaginable sacrifice, and shocking family secrets kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button right now. Share this incredible real-life mystery with your friends, and do not forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, jaw-dropping narratives delivered straight to your feed every single week. Join us